When the pandemic hit New York City, there was so much debate about whether to close the schools. I remember thinking about the dilemma involved. Closing schools so that they did not become an incubator for COVID-19 made perfect sense. But at the same time, you couldn't help but wonder what would happen to the many public school students who are homeless, and the many public school students who rely on the schools for a meal and various other resources. And what about remote learning? How would that work? Well, along with everything else that exposed our nation's inequalities, remote learning had its struggles, especially when it came to, you guessed it, students of color. As school systems around the country figure out how to make remote learning work in time for a new school year, I wonder whether remote learning will widen the quote-unquote achievement gap. Up next on Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. Welcome to another episode of Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. I'm sure many of you will join me in mourning the loss of the Netflix show Patriot Act with Hassan Minhaj. You know, I definitely valued his insightfulness, his jokes, his candor, and his shoe game. I don't know, maybe he'll get into podcasting, and I'm thinking that if he does do a podcast, he needs to do it with that guy. You remember that guy in the audience that one time who was talking about like aliens, apex predators, and swimming pools? I don't know, go back on Netflix if you don't remember. And I don't remember what season it was. I think it was maybe this last season that passed. This crazy guy in the audience that Hassan spent a lot of time talking to, and it was hilarious. And I remember sitting there thinking, please don't say something wild about the earth being flat. But I don't know. You know, Hassan Minhaj and DJ Khaled have been my spirit animals for a while. But, you know, with the luck that DJ Khaled might have, I don't know, I feel like he's going to end up getting canceled somehow. And isn't it kind of funny, though, that conspiracy theories don't hit certain famous people? Like, why hasn't anybody accused DJ Khaled of being part of Pizzagate? I mean, after all, my guy got a whole mansion in Miami somewhere. You cannot tell me that that guy is not hiding pizza somewhere over there. Nobody ever checked to see if he had any of those Wayfair cabinets either? I wonder. He got plenty of room for a Wayfair cabinet in his big mansion. I don't know. But anyway, let's start the episode. Before we address the issue of remote learning more closely, you're going to notice that I put achievement gap in quotation marks. And that's because I was talking to a teacher friend when I was preparing for this potential episode, and I was telling her that this was one of the topics that I was thinking about covering. And, you know, I mentioned the title, and I said remote learning in light of the achievement gap, and, you know, what the impact is going to be. And she corrected me, and she said, you know, the usage of the term achievement gap isn't even right. You see, the term that should be used here is opportunity gap. You know, language matters. And I know the standards in today's America has dropped so low that we sometimes forget about the language we use. But the words that we say are important. And I'm here to reaffirm that language matters. The things that you say, the context and the way that you say it, all of that matters. So the reason why the term opportunity gap is probably more appropriate is because it brings attention to the obstacles that young students face in their educational journey. And it puts the onus on an inequitable system for not providing opportunity. Meanwhile, if you use the term achievement gap, that puts the blame on children. And it implies that they aren't achieving the way that they should be, and that somehow it's their fault. And that's not fair, especially when our society forces students to navigate a system that is not equal. It's the disparities in education that make this issue one of an opportunity gap, not an achievement gap. The achievement gap speaks to the disparity in academic performance between groups, but mostly focuses on the different success rates between whites and students of color. But it's an unfair way to go about it. And you know why? Because it is unfair to use a standard to measure students that benefits white children, a standard that was created to benefit and created around white middle-class children. It's unfair to use such a standard for all of our students. So now we move on to what we have seen from remote learning thus far. There are concerns that, any gains that have been made in achieving equity in education will be wiped away because of disparities in access to computers, home internet connections, and direct instruction from teachers. It's amazing how we take for granted that everybody has a computer, everybody has a stable internet connection, but that's wrong. There's actually a real legitimate problem with the fact that everywhere in the country does not have internet, does not have broadband internet. And that's a fight that I think even a bill was brought up to Congress recently with regard to having internet extended everywhere. Because the way these ISP companies work is totally unfair and only benefits certain people and puts a lot of other people at disadvantage. And I can remember working at the public library years back. I worked in the public library twice in my life. Once when I was a junior in high school, and then I think I was failing a class, and then suddenly I couldn't work anymore. I think my mom was like, nah, you're failing this class, so you can't work anymore, so you have to quit. And then I quit that job, which I'm happy I did because I was kind of miserable anyway. And then I worked again for the public library in Manhattan. I worked for the New York Public Library, at the Science, Industry, and Business Library that I don't think exists anymore. I think they closed it down, but was on 34th and Madison. And I remember working at the library on both occasions and seeing how people are running to the computers to either do their homework or work on their resumes, because so many people at that time did not have stable internet connection to do the work that they needed to do to find a job, to go on a job interview, to work on a paper for school, because so many things are done online now. And I think we take for granted that, you can just do it on your computer. You can just type up a paper, or you can just submit a resume online. For so many Americans, for too many Americans, that's not a reality. They might have to go to a crowded library, wait hours for a computer, and hope that they can get it. And I remember in particular when I was in high school and I worked at the public library, all these kids fighting each other for the one or two computers that we had so that, one kid could do his or her homework. And I remember there was a young girl that used to walk in, and she just wanted to, somehow her father, they own a Chinese restaurant, and her father kind of put her in charge of making the menu or translating the menu from Mandarin to English. And it was a big responsibility for her. She was a very nice girl, and she always needed my help. And she was like, oh, how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I make this look better? And I remember it being so sad. If there was a computer in the household, she would be able to help her father better and not have to wait and compete with kids who are either doing their homework or trying to play games. And that was in the early 2000s. So to know that in 2020, people still don't have widespread access to internet or a computer is incredible to me. And not just, I'm not saying it's a New York problem. I don't know that it's a New York problem. Maybe it's not so much New York, but across the country, there is a big problem when it comes to internet equity and everybody having access to a computer and everybody having access to a stable broadband internet connection. And that's a big problem. And if you don't know about it, I would highly suggest looking it up. It is a major problem in America right now. So in closing, never take for granted that everybody just has a computer or everybody has stable broadband internet, even in 2020. But I digress. I do feel like, and just before I continue, there are also concerns that the high school dropout rate is going to increase and that these younger children who are going to school now are going to miss out on certain foundational concepts, certain concepts that teachers would say, if you don't learn them at a certain age, it's going to be very difficult to learn them later on in life. And my concern personally is I do feel like we're making light of the situation here, the dilemma that's coming. I mean, with everything that's coming with COVID, we're trying to keep people alive, but we're also struggling with education. And while it's dangerous for students to just go back to school physically, I think that there is a massive risk to the educational development of Black children in particular if we don't find better solutions for education in this COVID world. Because you know what? Not every parent has the resources to supplement a child's education at home when virtual learning is not as smooth. Think about it. A lot of parents themselves, a lot of parents of color themselves are essential workers. So this opens up a major challenge for them. Imagine having to physically go to work, navigate those dangers, and then figure out how your child who's at home, how to get them to do this remote learning thing. And I think that that's a major challenge. And we risk leaving behind a generation of children to a point of no return. For children of color in particular, their education is a pathway out of poverty and into the middle class. We know this with immigrants, for sure, that education is a gateway into the middle class for immigrants, for first and second generation immigrants. But we also know that for Black children, even Black American children in particular, if we're going to talk about generational wealth and, catching the Black community up so that there's equity in terms of the economy and in terms of money, education is a big driver in that. And the risk that COVID has is that not only is it going to wipe away the gains, but it's going to make this generational wealth that we talk about less attainable. Because with over 20 million people unemployed and having problems with education for our children, that's 2 generations affected. That's the working generation of people right now who have lost their jobs, who I'm sure are overwhelmingly Black and brown, and that is the education of the children. And knowing that their education is a gateway financially to generational wealth. And that's going to hurt Black and brown children more than it will hurt anybody else. And that's just a fact. So if education is put on hold, the financial implications, especially when you talk about, as I mentioned, generational wealth, that is startling. I want you to consider an analysis that was done by McKinsey and Company, and that shows that while white children may fall back 7 months academically, Black and Hispanic students may fall back 9 and 10 months. 9 and 10 months. That's critical. We're talking about almost a whole year left back. I want to also take a moment to talk about what we've seen in the Chicago public schools. You know, I think sometimes we have to look outside of where we live to see the impact on other major school systems in other major cities in the country. We know that Chicago has its struggles. So I think that's why, in particular, it's also very interesting to talk about Chicago. So in the Chicago public schools, they have lost contact with more than 2,250 students in seeing if they have digital access. And it was found that African American and Latino students were least likely to use Google Meet or Classroom, which are the two platforms that they were using in the education system at that time. We're talking about 70% of African Americans and 78% of Latino students accessing the platform at least once, compared to 87% of white and Asian students in grades 1st through 12th. So that's a big disparity if we're talking statistics here. And then finally, I have particular concerns when it comes to mental health and emotional well-being. You know, schools provide mental health resources and services that a lot of students that really need them are probably no longer getting. And with students of color in particular being disproportionately impacted by the virus, those services are going to be needed even more. So it's not enough to get students back to school, back to learning, and get them back on track. We have to figure out how we're going to manage the emotional and mental damage that COVID has brought to our communities. We have to figure out how we're going to manage that. And that in itself is a big challenge, because let me tell you something. If a student is having emotional and mental issues, they can't learn. If a student is hungry, they can't learn. So we have to make sure that we're covering all of our ground bases before we have an expectation that children are just going to go to school, learn, be focused, and be successful. Now, when I come back after this break, I'm going to have an amazing interview with a former teacher of mine, and we're going to talk about his experiences with remote learning during COVID at the school that he teaches at. And I really hope that talking to a teacher, a former teacher, someone I really care about and admire, will shed more light on this issue. And so we'll do that when we come back on Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. Hello, lovely listeners. This is Mike here. It is my hope and desire that you are truly enjoying this podcast. I want this experience to be as interactive as possible. So if you have a question or response to anything that you've heard on this podcast, send me an email at theracewarspodcast@gmail.com, or send me a DM on my official Instagram account for this podcast and follow us at _race_wars_podcast. Interact with me also on Facebook at facebook.com/theracewarspodcast. Let's talk. I'll be waiting for you. Okay, welcome back to Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. And I have with me one of my former teachers, Brian China. It's very, very hard for me to call you Brian, but I'm going to go for it.
Yeah, you have my permission to do that.
It's great to talk to you. It's great to speak with you. And
thanks for having me.
To get your input on, what's going on out there. And I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and talking to me and talking to everyone who's going to be listening.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, especially in the field of education. We're about 2 weeks away from starting school, and lots still up in the air. And I'm excited to share what I know, and we'll see what happens in the next 2 weeks. I think there's going to be a lot going on.
Okay, okay. And with regard to the remote learning experiment that, everyone was sort of thrown into this last minute, how did your school go about implementing remote learning?
I think you used the key term there, thrown in. And one thing I'll point out to a lot of people is, I think schools, and nobody was prepared for this, but I think an additional challenge that some people kind of overlook is the fact that when we left school in mid-March, we kind of thought we were going to be out for, maybe a few days or maybe a week. Then it became 2 weeks. And then we figured, all right, we'll go back. And then it was another 2 weeks. And then it was another 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden, we just canceled the rest of the year. So schools really weren't prepared to be out that long. And even my school, when we came up with our kind of plan of how we were going to start that distance learning, it was kind of just like a Band-Aid just to kind of cover, like I said, a few days or a week. So our plan was we jumped on WebEx, which is similar to Zoom, which I think most people know. Teachers were kind of given flexibility on how they wanted to reach out to their students. Most teachers used WebEx, as well as, pushing out assignments. We used OneNote, which is part of the Microsoft Office. So we were able to send out worksheets and assignments and notes and homeworks while also supplementing that with the live instruction on WebEx, which, again, would have worked had it only been a few days or even a couple weeks. But in the end, we did the best we could. I think we did fairly well under the circumstances. But I think had we known it was going to be a longer time period, I think we probably would have tackled it differently because, it was hard. You certainly had technology issues. We had quite a few students who either didn't have iPads or really for us, we also had a lot of students who didn't have internet. We also struggled with accountability because a lot of students, wouldn't show up. We had no requirement that students had to show their face. So students would sign in and the class would end and you might have, 10 to 15 kids who were just there, but they didn't log off, which means that they logged in and then they maybe went back to sleep or were doing something else. It was tough, obviously, with the assignments because there's really no, way you could give tests. So a lot of teachers kind of gave essay assignments and things like that. But like I said, I think the key challenge there was just that not only were we thrown into it, but we didn't know how long it was going to be. And like I said, we planned for a week ahead, and then all of a sudden, the year was over. So that was kind of our experience. Again, I under the circumstances, I think we did all right. But I think going forward, as we return to school in a few weeks, obviously we're going to be opening up under hybrid. But even if we do go completely distance learning from home, I think it's going to be a very different experience. And I think it has to be.
Why do you say that?
Just because I think that, like I said, I teach AP courses, so I naturally have kids who are more motivated. And, even I had some kids who, without the kind of structure, like I said, we didn't have a schedule. Teachers kind of just made their own WebEx sessions whenever they wanted. We had challenges where teachers were scheduling WebEx sessions while another teacher was, and kids either had to choose or they had to split their time. So that was a big issue. And then there was really, we didn't take attendance. We didn't track that. We didn't give any real formative assessments. We kind of had this loose grading policy, and unfortunately, a lot of kids did fall through the cracks. Some through just lack of motivation, some through lack of accountability, and then, as I alluded to before, some just because they didn't have the technology piece. So they physically were unable to participate.
Yeah, you mentioned the technology piece. I imagine, as you mentioned, the school was able to provide laptops. Was the school able to do anything for students who didn't have internet access at all?
The school actually really stepped up. First of all, most of our students do have iPads. Although, students obviously break their iPads, they lose their iPads. So the school really made a big push to try to get iPads and new iPads into the hands of those kids who had either lost or broken their issued iPad. And then as far as the technology issues, we're kind of a middle-class district, but we do have some kids who don't have, access to internet. And our guidance department and our administration really did a good job trying to get those kids either on the hotspots. Unfortunately, we have some kids who were living in hotels. They actually contacted the hotel and tried to get them onto some sort of Wi-Fi setup. So we did try to kind of troubleshoot that as best we could. But, you know, like I said, just being thrown into it, you know, there was a delay, and really even really realizing that this would be a problem. You know, there's so many things that you didn't think about that all of a sudden became a problem that you then had to kind of troubleshoot. And by that point, you're 2 or 3 weeks into it, and that's been time that's been, you know, lost for the kids.
What do you think is going to happen with the new school year coming up? What do you think is going to happen in terms of the type of instruction that you're able to give? Are you going to find yourself having to go back and review a lot of things, or do you feel like you're going to be able to move forward and sort of continue from where you left off?
It's a great question. I don't know. You know, one of the first things I plan to do is kind of talk to my students who I'm going to meet in a couple of weeks and kind of see how they feel. I teach you a sister, as you know. I taught it to you many, many years ago. You know, so for me, in terms of content, I can start at the beginning. But there's a real concern of mine for skills. You know, writing skills, comprehension skills, analytical skills. That I think, you know, especially early on, I'm going to gear a lot of my lessons towards those skills because I think a lot of that probably was lost. You know, you have to realize a lot of these students, they're going to be out of school for 6 months. I mean, that's half a year. It's a tremendous amount of time. And even my own kids, you know, I make my kids do work in the summer, and I see a real slip this year. You know, they're struggling even with the work I'm giving them in the summer, and I've had to spend more time with them than ever before, just kind of catching them up to where they should be. So I do think it'll impact my instruction this year. And, you know, like I said, I'm going to have to kind of see the damage that I'm getting once they get there and I talk to the kids and they kind of get to see it firsthand.
Were any students or parents expressing any particular concerns to you?
About this year or this past year?
Well, both.
Yeah, you know, it's a frustrating situation, and obviously there's so many things that go into it. You know, I think for the most part, the community was really supportive of what we did, and I think that they realized that we did the best we could under challenging circumstances. You know, but as we go forward now, you have some parents who need their kids in school because they work and they need to get to work to support their family. So that's, you know, one side that we're seeing. Then you see, of course, the natural side that you have parents who are really concerned about the health and safety of their kids, and they want to make sure that we're, you know, adhering to all the CDC protocols and that their kids are going to be safe. And then you have other parents who are focused more on the educational component where, you know, they want to know what we're going to do to make up for that lost time. And on the high school model, where the kids are coming in every other day. So there's a real concern of what are the kids going to do when they're at home. Right. Some schools have gone to live streaming, so a kid at home will be able to watch the class. Certainly not as good as being there, but at least they'll be able to see the teacher content. Other schools, and I think mine's leaning towards this, are going to push up kind of independent assignments. And obviously there's a real concern there of, you know, how are students going to teach themselves this material? You know, if they have no one to reach out to, no one to teach it to them. So there's a lot of concerns. And like I said, kind of what happened in this past spring, I think we're going to have things that come up that we can't even envision now that we're going to have to deal with really on the fly. So, yeah, there's a lot of concern about a variety of things as we enter the school year.
Now, I'm not aware of the composition of the classes you teach in terms of, you know, the amount of students of color that you have. But for the students of color that are in your class or that you know of around the school, have you seen particularly strong challenges that they're facing with the remote learning model?
I would say about 80% of our school are students of color. And I mean, I wouldn't say that there's any particular instances that students are experiencing because of the color of their skin. To me, I think it's more socioeconomic. And like I said, the access to Wi-Fi, the access to technology. You know, so even if the kids have iPads, you know, they have to type a paper. I had a lot of kids message me saying, hey, I can't type this paper, I don't have a keyboard. You know, whereas normally if I give them an assignment, they'd be able to go to our library and use the keyboard. I had kids who didn't have access to a keyboard. And as you know, I teach AP classes. The College Board gave those exams. One of the major issues we had was that students didn't have a printer. Students didn't have a keyboard. So we actually, one of the things I did, the College Board allowed students to handwrite their essays. I went to the school and actually handed out packets to students who didn't have keyboards, or even some who just preferred to handwrite it.
Right.
So, I mean, if you're looking at race, obviously you're tying the socioeconomic and all the factors that lead to that. I think that was a major issue. And I think that'll be a major issue as we come to it again this year. The socioeconomic impact of students with especially the distance learning.
Right. And what about special education students? I mean, I know you don't teach special education students, but I wonder if you happen to know of any of the challenges that they're facing in your school at this time.
I have, a few. I have one of my nephews actually is special needs.
Okay.
And then, of course, I work in a school. We're a small school. So I can speak for my nephew, who is not in the district where I teach, and I can speak in the district where I teach, where one of the things that is going to happen is a lot of districts having their special needs kids come in every day. Mm-hmm. So whereas other students might come in every other day, and that's kind of the typical model on the high school level, a lot of schools are having their special needs as well as their ENL population come in every day. So that they'll be able to get that live instruction and that interaction piece that I really think is so critical for them. As they're both groups who are really underserved with the model that we ended up going with, and really all schools had to go with at the end of last school year.
Interesting. Do you have any thoughts or concerns, or do you know of what the impact will likely be on your students in terms of their mental health and well-being regarding everything that has happened with the coronavirus and with having to do the remote learning? Do you see any potential issues down the pipeline with regards to their emotional well-being?
Yeah, I mean, those issues are here. I have never had more kids reach out to me saying, hey, I need to get back to school. I can't do this. And you're younger than I am. Forget the education, component for a second. I just can't imagine being a teenager, a high school kid, being locked in quarantine, with my parents and just kind of losing all sorts of freedom. Right. And, obviously we're in mid-August now, but, you remember, you go back to March, April, May, we were locked in our houses. So, a lot of my students really struggled. And, that's another thing that, obviously the fact that they were frustrated, this is a crazy situation. The seniors, God bless them, they were miserable because they lost out on prom, their senior trip, their senior barbecue, their graduation, all that stuff. But, even as a teacher, and I think back to my relationship with you and all the fun things and all the moments that we had. And, even when I've talked to you now, we were kind of talking before about some of the funny things that happened. Right. A major part of why I like being a teacher, so I can connect with students. And I think that a lot of students kind of go to school so they have that interaction with their friends, but also their teachers. You get to know the students as people, and we get to kind of, hear their problems. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard crazy things or problems that kids have had even before their own parents have. That is something that was kind of lost in all this, because even in the WebEx sessions I had, I mostly focused on content. I kind of lost that opportunity to just talk to a kid and get him before class or after class or in the hall and just talk to them about, the Mets game, or maybe a marching band or a club they're in, or something that I normally would talk to them about. And it was weird because we used the Remind app, which is kind of like a texting app for teachers, where students and teachers can interact without, sharing each other's numbers. It's through a neutral third party. And they just started texting me kind of things about their day. And it took me a little while to just realize that they just missed being able to kind of share their experiences and what was going on, and just having an adult that they could talk to. Right. So, I don't, that's why I think going back is so important. And even though it's on this hybrid model, I really hope that it works, because I think these kids need to interact with their peers. I think they need to get up and they need to, take a shower and brush their teeth and put on clothes and get out of the house. And they need to see their teachers and the school faculty and interact with them. I just hope it works because I think it is very scary for the social health of these kids to kind of be cooped up at home again and have to sit in front of a computer screen for 8 hours a day. That is a long time to sit in front of a computer screen. So I'm hoping for the best, but yeah, I definitely have concerns about that moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely feel those concerns. I can't imagine what it must be like to be a high school student right now, and have to go through what's going on and lose out on all of those social moments that you look forward to and you cherish as a teenager. One thing that
Yeah,
I'm,
I mean,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, even for my own kids, my daughter's in sixth grade. Her she graduates elementary school. She already lost her trip. They've already canceled a bunch of functions they were going to have. Kindergartners. My nephew's a kindergartner. He's all upset because it's he's got to wear a mask and he's not going to be able to talk to his friends. So, you think about it, I feel bad for the seniors. Then you think about kindergarten, it must be so hard for them. If you're a kid, every year is important. Every year has its memories. And unfortunately, with the situation, they're kind of being robbed of those experiences. And you just kind of hope that this is we somehow get this to back to normal soon because we're half a year in.
Right. One thing that I've thought about to ask you, and I'd be very interested and curious about your opinion. Now, obviously, you taught at my high school and you remember what that experience was like. If this had happened back when I was in high school, or say, you were teaching at my high school now, if it still existed as, that school itself, what do you think would have been different about that experience compared to the experience you're having at your school? For anybody who didn't go to my high school, there were a lot of challenges with regard to, it was a lot tougher. There was a lot more poverty. There were a lot more behavioral issues. There were a lot of struggles in that high school. And I imagine it was a very different environment from what you're getting now. How do you think this would have worked, or would it have worked, remote learning for that school compared to where you are now?
Well, first, I'll age just a little bit. I think the technology piece that we have now is we're just so blessed to have the ability to do things like Zoom and WebEx. I can't imagine going back to me and you when we were in that school together, when there just would have been no way to have done this. But right. In terms of my experience now in a suburban school versus the city, and as you said, kind of maybe a bit of a rougher school, and obviously I talk to a lot of people in the city still. There's just so many kids who are falling through the cracks, and it's really going to be detrimental because that's just time you're not going to get back. And for a kid who lacks motivation, to be given such a lack of structure, it's just going to be disastrous because kids who are on the fence before between going to class and doing the right thing or blowing off class and hanging out with your friends are going to now have an easier time to do that. Plus the city system is just so big. And then as you said, the poverty is also greater. So I assume the city is working hard to get iPads or some sort of devices into the hands of everybody. But when you think of the fact that you have some schools in the city that are, probably between 3, 4, even 5,000 kids,
right?
It's just going to be impossible to safely get them in there every day. And that's why for me, I think that being in a suburban district, to have these smaller districts who can make localized decisions and have the ability to kind of, buy that technology and get into the hands of their students, they're going to be at such an advantage over some of your city schools who just aren't going to be able to do that and just don't have the students who are going to kind of take it seriously and come up and get the iPad and go to class and do all of that. And then what do? Schools aren't going to want to fail all these kids. So, they're going to try to find some way to push them through, which is something that a lot of schools have done in the past. Probably. It's really scary. And I really feel for a lot of the students in the city, and I feel for the teachers who are going to try to make this work as best they can. But, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out on such a large scale in the largest public education system in the country.
Yeah. I mean, one of my major concerns with this is when you look at generational wealth, and you know that there's obviously a major disparity between children of color, or, well, people of color rather, and white people with regard to generational wealth. And education is supposed to be the way that we kind of equalize it a little bit. It's supposed to be the way that we get people of color into the middle class. With what's happening now with this disruption in education, where do you see the economy in terms of what's happening? Where do you see, children of color, they're going to become adults, they're going to eventually move on to college and move on to trying to get employment. Where do you see this generational wealth problem? Do you see it getting worse because of what we're seeing? I mean, where will the equalizer be? I just wonder.
It's a very fair question, and I'll just kind of share this as well. When you kind of spoke about generational wealth, I remember when I was at the school that we were at, you had a lot of immigrant families, and you had a lot of parents who came here, and then the American dream, they worked hard, they sent their kids to school, but they worked 2, 3, even 4 jobs to support their family and live here. And one of the challenges I think it's going to present to a lot of these families, where you have, one parent or even both parents who are out of the house having to work to put food on the table, is they're not going to be there to make sure that their kids are going to class and doing their work and studying still. Usually the teacher in school would push them, or an administrator would, but being at home either every day or even every other day, there's going to really be nobody there to force that. And, being a teacher who was at home, one of the advantages I had was that I was able to make sure my kids were going to their classes and doing their work. And I really worry, when we talk about generational wealth and generations of, families now who, like I said, are going to be working to provide for the family, there's going to be nobody home to make sure that they're going to those classes and doing all those things that they need to do to keep pace and stay on track of their work. I don't know what the equalizer becomes.
Right.
And I don't know what schools can even do in this instance. I would imagine that communication is going to be key. That schools are going to have to be in communication with parents and really try to really form a partnership. Everyone always talks about this partnership between parents and the school. It's going to be so pivotal now that parents really, partner with the schools, and schools communicate with the parents, because there is a great opportunity for students to fall through the cracks. And, if this goes on another year, that's 18 months. You're going to have kids who don't recover from that.
Yeah. I think that's the big fear is, the longer this goes, the worse it is. The worse it'll be, and the worse it'll be for the future.
Yeah, but not only that, if you think about it, you were a teenager and you were a great kid. You remember some of your peers who didn't take school as seriously. They had 18 months where they were able to kind of, or even 6 months or 12 months, where they were able to kind of take off and fall through the cracks, and nobody called them out on it and pushed them to do it.
Right.
Once things got back to normal, would they return and kind of go back to school and take things seriously? I don't think a lot of kids would or will. And I think that's a real concern. I think we're going to lose a lot of kids. And, then where do you go? Kids, 14, 15, 16 years old, we all made dumb decisions at that age. But, luckily we had a school or parents or something there that kind of hopefully brought us back to, put us back on the right track. But I'm really scared that you're going to have kids who kind of go down the wrong track here, and they're just going to go so far down that track that they're not going to be able to get back.
Right. Yeah. Those are some sober words that you just brought up, some really interesting points. I want to thank you for coming and talking. Well, you didn't come here, obviously. We're talking over the phone. But I want to thank you for talking to me about this issue, for, being here with me and talking, and everything that we're talking about is so true and so important, and these issues are so important. So once again, Brian, and it really bothers me to call you Brian, but I'm going to do it again. You know what it is? It's a weird respect thing.
Right.
It's a weird respect thing, and it doesn't matter if I saw my kindergarten teacher, I would probably call her Miss So-and-so. It's hard to get out of. But thank you so much once again, and thank you for coming on Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. We had such a great conversation with my old teacher, Brian China. I want to thank him for coming on the program and talking to all of us and really giving some really important information out there. And it's so important to get firsthand experience about what's going on, especially with regard to remote learning and how it has impacted and continues to impact our community. So I'm very grateful for Brian China, who teaches a lot of students of color, to be able to come on and talk about his experience, because, you know, I'm not a teacher. And as much as I can give you information from a sort of academic point of view and my opinion and what my experiences are and what I have noticed in my research, there's no better experience than that of somebody who is in the classroom and somebody who's been a teacher for a number of years and who's done this work. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And I hope that you enjoyed that especially as well. My final words that I will say before I sign off on this episode of Race Wars is that this is a very important topic. This is a very important issue, and we just have to see the remote learning situation is still developing. There's still so much that we don't know, and there's still so much uncertainty. So I hope that this episode will help people to pay attention to what's going on and to see that we're going through a real dangerous road here in education right now, especially when it comes to children of color. We really need to figure out what is the next step. And I don't know. I don't have all the answers. Education is complex. Education in big cities, especially, very complex. We're talking about very big systems here. But the casualties are real. I mean, you heard my guest say it himself. His concern is that we're going to lose a lot of children, and a lot of children are going to fall under the cracks, especially in the city schools. So what do we do, right? If you have any questions about anything you've heard on this program, or if you have a comment, you know where you can email me, right? I've said this like 30,000 times, but I'm going to say it again. You can send me an email at theracewarspodcast@gmail.com. That is theracewarspodcast@gmail.com. And while you're at it, why don't you follow us at _race_wars_podcast. Interact with us also on Facebook at facebook.com/theracewar podcast. And you know what? Let's talk. I'll be waiting for you. Until next time, and as I always say, much love. And if nobody else is proud of you, I'm proud of you. Signing off, God bless.